Aloha Friday, everybody. Welcome. Come on in, take a seat. You'll excuse me while I take off my mask to stand up here and talk to you. And I think, according to university rules, if our speakers are comfortable, they can do the same. Welcome everybody online too. I understand we have a number of folks online, so welcome. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. I know our folks have already tested that. Yeah, I'm getting positive nods on that. So I'm not going to talk too long or stand up here too long because you did not come here to hear me say anything really when it comes down to it. But I'm still going to take the opportunity to welcome you all. And man, I don't know if you know this, but we've had 22 of our Peter J. Rappa Fellows. And as Maya pointed out to me, it's the year 2022. So there's something there. I don't know what it is. There's something there. We're going to have more than 23 when we get to 2023, but that's what that is. It's amazing though that it's been that amount of time. 12th summer. So 12 summers we've been at this, and you know, lots of changes. I mean, back then, and in the room for those that are online is the esteemed E. Gordon Graw, who was our director at the time when all this began. So we've had a lot of changes over time, and a lot of, as we said, 22 fellows come through, and each and every one of them with just incredible projects, and then going on to do some really impressive things following. And some of those former fellows are here and working back at UH. So it's just been it's just really kind of amazing how you start a little thing and you don't really, you know it's a good thing, but you don't really know how good it's going to be. And then you get, like I said, 10 years out, 12 years out, and you go, wow. I have notes here. Thank you, Maya. And I need to, of course, thank everybody that's involved, which includes Melanie Lander. I moved seats on me. I'm going to look at you right there. Melanie Lander and Katie Hinson and Beth Lenz and Shelley Habel, who served as mentors this year. Thank you for that. And for those that don't know, yeah, thank you. Yeah, for those that don't know, our faculty kind of step up every summer and suggest projects and volunteer really their time on top of everything else they're doing to be mentors with our fellows. So thank you for that. And also thank you Brad Romine and Wendy McGurl, who I don't think is here with us today. She's online. Thank you. Hi, Wendy. And Colin is in the back of the room and was a former fellow who have served as project advisors. So thank you, folks. Thank you also Office of Naval Research Climate Change Project, Colin works for now, who co-sponsored a fellow with us this year. So we're always looking for those opportunities. If you know folks that might be interested in co-sponsoring a fellow as we grow the program. And well, let's face it, we talk about that. We welcome donations. And I know we want to be able to kind of not only thank those that have, and I don't know exactly who's all online, but I tell you, we've got a few folks that were friends of Peter's that continue to provide funding in support of these fellows. And we continue to try to grow that base. It's with our University of Hawaii Foundation. So if so moved, and please come talk to any one of us about how you might continue to support the program as we continue to grow the program. With that, I do want to invite, and hopefully not as a surprise, she says, no, of course not, Myrtle Ching Rappa, if she would, Myrtle, you wouldn't mind coming up and sharing a few words and thoughts with our in-room and online audience. I know, it's not a beautiful turn later, but it is nice.
Maya asked me if I would mind saying a few words, and my response is, I love talking about Peter, so it's never you know, I don't have to plan anything. I can just, had hours, I talked to you for hours about him. He would be so proud of this program and all of you. And I think you would be really happy to see that some of the earlier fellows are now mentoring other fellows. Like Darren said, it's hard to believe it's been 12 years. I miss that guy every single day. Every time I see a beer, I miss him. Every time I see a baseball game, I miss him. I miss him a lot when there are movies I want to see and he's not around to take me. But he loved working here and he loved working with the environment. Some of the people here may not know, Peter sponsored the first Earth Day in Hawaii. And that meant programs all over the place in Waikīkī, up and down the mall here. And he was a true environmentalist. And he's made environmentalists out of many, many people in our family and outside the family. So I know he would be very happy. I was going to say, if he was here, he'd be really proud. Except if he was here, he wouldn't have the program. So he'll just have to enjoy it from wherever he is. Anyway, thank you guys.
All right. Okay, let's bring up Katie Hinson. She's going to introduce our first speaker.
Okay. Aloha, everyone. My name is Katie Hinson. I'm an extension agent here with Hawaii Sea Grant, and I had the honor of getting to work with the Rappa fellow Sarah Chin this summer, along with lots of really wonderful mentors as part of this project, as well as Beth Lenz, Dr. Rosie Allegado, and Sara Kahanamoku as well. So I just wanted to say that Sarah did an amazing job with what you will see is a really overwhelming research task to have over the course of just 8 weeks. We threw a lot of curveballs at her and a lot of changes of direction, and she tackled everyone with just incredible creativity and dedication and problem solving and maturity. And I also was really inspired by her approach to this project, which you'll see deals with questions of ethics and social justice. And she really had a very nuanced and passionate and empathetic approach to these topics. So I think she just did an amazing job. I'm so excited to see where she goes next. And we will be with her along the journey of wherever she goes next, and hope that she will stay in touch and lean on us for more support and more just friendship as she moves forward. So, Sarah.
This is a cool photo of yours, but that's not what we're doing. I'll let you do what you need to do.
Yeah. Aloha and good afternoon, everybody. Take this off. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for the introduction, Katie and Myrtle, for those kind words and those words about Peter. As Katie said, my name is Sarah Chin. I have been so honored to serve as a Rappa fellow this summer. Oh, I feel like I'm getting kind of emotional.
Yeah, it's emotional.
Yeah, it is. The title of my research is Pilina Kai, Assessing Local Connectivity of Hawaiʻi-based Marine and Coastal Research. Here, Pilina meaning connection to or relationship to, and Kai, the ocean or areas near the ocean. Again, thank you so much to my mentors, Katie Hinson and Beth Lenz, Dr. Beth Lenz, and to collaborators and other kind of advisors, Dr. Rosie Allegado, Sara Kahanamoku, and of course, Maya Walton. No, you come on, Maya. You planned out my life for the past 8 weeks. You're just such a, Maya is such a warm introduction to this program and has just been such an amazing support throughout it. So thanks to everyone. So let's get started. Today I'm going to go over just the goals of my specific fellowship, my project overview, results of the project, implications and potential future directions of the study, and then a quick reflection just on my summer. So I had like two kind of components of my fellowship. The first was this local connectivity project that the majority of my presentation will kind of focus on. And the question that I was hoping to kind of answer with my study was how much of the coastal and marine research about the Hawaiian Islands or conducted here in the Hawaiian Islands is authored by scientists actually based in Hawaii. And that question came out of this lots of conversations and thought processes of the Ulani'ike Center of Excellence or for Excellence, who, if I think most people here are familiar with Ulani'ike, but if you're not, their mission is to serve as a collaborative hub, coordinating Sea Grant faculty and partners who work on projects that engage in multiple knowledge systems. So they have done and continue to do so much important work on just spreading knowledge about best practices for engaging in reciprocal science and protecting Indigenous knowledge sovereignty here in Hawaii. So just to keep in mind that this question really came from them. And then the second component, which is DAJA, or Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice and Accessibility here at Hawaii Sea Grant. Beth was really just amazing in inviting me to kind of sit in on the National Sea Grant DAJA meetings, and they're working to create this like evaluation retreat for the National Sea Grant program regarding DAJA. So I got to kind of be a fly on the wall, and I learned a ton from that. Then I also got to sit on the Hawaii Sea Grant specific DAJA meetings every month, which was also great. Just learned so much from everybody here. And just in shadowing, Beth kind of gained some experience working, what would it be like to work, what is it like to work as a DAJA professional here in an environmental field and an environmental organization, which is something I hope to kind of pursue after this fellowship. So just really, truly amazing experiences. So let's get into this connectivity project. Again, this, my goal is to assess local connectivity of Hawaii-based marine and coastal research. And so the Hawaiian Islands have some of the highest levels of terrestrial biodiversity seen in any tropical ecosystem on the planet, as well as the highest levels of marine endemism. And so for those reasons and others, environmental scientists, oceanographers, biologists have flocked here to conduct research. So something to keep in mind is that a lot of the science and the type of science that these researchers kind of subscribe to or operate under is Western science, which I define as objective and qualitative based science that relies on the the transmission of the knowledge relies on academia. So there is this kind of large body of research that tells us that Western science can be quite extractive in nature. And what I mean by that is that under this framework of Western science, researchers aren't necessarily penalized for taking data, knowledge, specimens from places or people, community members, without giving something back or like establishing genuine relationships. So in understanding that context, my study asks, again, how much of the coastal and marine research about the Hawaiian Islands are conducted here in the Hawaiian Islands is authored by scientists based in Hawaii. And we chose to analyze this place-based authorship affiliation after conducting a literature review about extractive science and learning that one indicator of connectivity in terms of scientists being connected to communities or place is if one person on that team, on the research team, has an affiliation to the place or with the place. And so in this case, it's Hawaii. And this is an indicator that, again, we found throughout our literature review, but we also thought would be kind of measurable, especially in this time span of 8 weeks. But that being said, I do need to acknowledge that while authorship affiliation does provide us, some foundation for our understanding of the amount of extractive science that happens here in Hawaii, it certainly doesn't paint the full picture. So there are definitely, Hawaii-based scientists who engage in extractive science. Conversely, there are externally based science who do not. So this study really just is kind of laying the groundwork for future work. And yeah, that's what we hope happens, future work. So just take a look at our study setup here. This is what I was trying to do, determine the percentages of Hawaii-based authorship versus externally based authorship of Hawaiian Islands coastal and marine research published between 1990 and 2020 using Google Scholar. So just to give you an overview of kind of what my 8 weeks looked like, we started with a literature review, which was put together by the wonderful Sadaka Hanamoku, which gave me an overview of just what's happening here in Hawaiian Islands regarding to parachute science, community involvement, the measurement of community involvement, engagement with scientists, and Indigenous knowledge sovereignty. I'm not currently Hawaii-based. I'm just here, right now for the summer. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? And I'm not from Hawaii. So it's important to note that in my approach to this research, and the literature review was super, crucial in building my understanding of the situation of extractive science here in Hawaii, and also building, my future plans to stay connected with this research and stay connected with Hawaii Sea Grant. So that first phase was literature review, scoping. We spent a little bit longer on scoping than we thought we were going to, but that's kind of the nature of these projects. We spent a while, kind of narrowing down our timeline. And you saw earlier, we chose this timeline of this 30 years between 1990 and 2020. Fields of study, coastal and marine research. That's what Hawaii Sea Grant does. So that's why we chose coastal and marine. And then the database decision, which was Google Scholar, and I'll go talk about that just in a couple minutes. Third phase was the data collection and analysis piece. And again, I'll go through that in just a minute. And then the final report, I've, along with my collaborators, advisors, written a issue brief for the use of Hawaii Sea Grant. Hopefully can be used to kind of disseminate this information later on. So methods. I said we chose Google Scholar. There were a couple of reasons for that. I think the main one was that we wanted to look at authorship, and we were looking at like Scopus and some other databases, and Google Scholar kind of gave us the flexibility we needed to extract like this authorship question and find an answer to it. And we also found through a couple different studies that Google Scholar has the most diverse range of scientific publications as compared to, again, like Web of Science or something like Scopus, and diverse in that it has, peer-reviewed journal articles, but it also contains like book chapters and dissertations where that's not the case for other databases. And it also has publications that aren't in English, which is important. So all of those, for those reasons, it was just important to have like the most diverse, range of data as we possibly could get. So then 1990 to 2020 is our time range. At the beginning of the study, we were hoping to do a larger one. We were hoping to do something like 1960 to 2020. But with the methodology we chose and just the remaining time we had, we decided to just stick with this range of years because we kind of thought like, we assumed there was going to be like an interesting data trend here just because of, the advent of the internet and data accessibility, and that will come back later in the presentation. But yeah, so that's why we have that range. And then these are just some examples of like the search queries that I use. So for a couple of weeks, I would go into Google Scholar and type in Hawaiian Islands coastal as my search, and put in a specific year range and just see what publications would come up, just the number of publications, log that, and then go back and do Hawaiian Islands coastal, the same search, but with Hawaii zip codes. And then I would compare those numbers. And here's just a little kind of screenshot of what this would look like. So at the top here, I have my search, Hawaiian Islands coastal, custom range. This is just for the year 1990, but I did do this like for all the years in aggregate, 1990 to 2020. And then do it individually for each year. So you can see here at the top, maybe you can't, but it says about 642 results come up here. And then I would go back, do the same search and just add the Hawaiian Island zip codes, same year. Making sure that patents and citations are not included. So our hope was that the zip codes were only registering with like our author bios and not anywhere else in the paper. And I have 21 results that come back. And so from that 640 number to 21 seems like a really large reduction. And the reason for that is because so Google Scholar wouldn't accept all of the Hawaiian Island zip codes at once. So I just kind of chunked them up and did them one by one. So on the other side here, you can see an example. This is just like a little bit of what my my data sheets would look like. And so you can see there are like 4 numbers that are being added up together. And that just represents each Hawaiian Island zip code chunk. And to get our percentages of externally based science versus Hawaii-based science, we would just subtract the zip code number from kind of that general search and calculate the percentages from there. So I've been saying these words Hawaii-based and externally based a lot, and not defining them, so forgive me for that, but I'm going to do that now. Hawaii-based are publications that have at least one Hawaii-based author. So there are multiple authors on most papers. So just to understand that not every author that is logged, not every author on a paper, not every publication that has, multiple authors, it's just as long as one registered as Hawaii-based, we count it as Hawaii-based. And then externally based were publications that didn't register any Hawaii-based authors at all. And this, I just wanted to show you like what a bigger kind of snapshot of what my data looked like. This is just from 1990 to 1996, but I was just kind of talking about these coastal searches. I just want to make sure everyone knows it was the same exact process for marine. Okay, so limitations. This is a really high level study. It's a wide, like a big overview. And because of that, we have a lot of limitations, but a few I wanted to point out. One, we didn't use any other databases aside from Google Scholar. So we're missing a lot of publications, right? Like I keep mentioning Web of Science and Scopus because they're just at the top of my head, but we're not including any of the publications there. So we're missing out on a lot of information. Second, there's this possibility of double counting our publications. Coastal and marine work, as we all know, goes hand in hand. And so it's possible that, again, like we're including the same publications a couple of times. And then including non-related studies. So it's possible that there are some publications that mention coastal and marine science, maybe in their intro, but the actual publication itself doesn't have anything to do with, is it or isn't really a coastal and marine study. Yeah, so just want to put it out there and make sure everyone kind of understands that we understand that this study is really just kind of scratching the surface of this question of, how much extractive science is happening here. But yeah, we hope that it lays a good foundation for future studies. So my results, or our results rather. This is, so just to orient ourselves, we've got on the x-axis here, 1990 to 2020, just our years. And on the y-axis, the number of publications that would come up for these search queries. The blue line is representing our Hawaiian Islands marine publications, and the red line represents our Hawaiian Islands coastal publications. And the big takeaway of this figure is that the number of Hawaiian Islands focused marine and coastal publications have steadily increased over the past 3 decades. Just the sheer amount of science or publications that are coming out of this type of research has increased, which is important to note. Next, again, we've got the years on our X and the number of publications on our Y. This is actually the same curve you're seeing. So these dark blue lines is the same publication curve, just a bit stretched out. What we're seeing here is that we've got here on this, the white, the more pale lines, this represents our Hawaii-based, our publications with Hawaii-based authorship. So over time, Hawaii-based authorship of Hawaiian Islands marine and coastal publications hasn't dramatically changed, and it's remained relatively low. So the kind of shaded in areas represent our externally based authorship. And you can see that's risen with the rise in publications in general. So this is just a more granular look at those, the kind of portion of Hawaii-based compared to externally based authorship. And sorry, these are super tiny, but you're seeing the same thing here in the year. And then the y-axis is our percentage of externally based versus Hawaii-based authorship. And what you can see over time is that the publications with Hawaii-based authorship has actually decreased, which is something that I think a lot, like we weren't expecting that. So it was a shock to us, but really important to note. So how can we explain these trends? I think we, in our conversations, just kind of kept landing on this data accessibility piece. Google Scholar itself even was released to the public in about 2004, I think, along with a lot of other of these similar scholarship databases. The omics revolution was in full swing. And it's the same, so that time frame is where we see a spike in publications start to happen. And so it kind of tells us the story of like, okay, so maybe there's all these externally based authors who are realizing like, oh, I actually don't have to travel to Hawaii to do a study on Hawaii anymore. I can, fully complete a full study without traveling there and without making relationships with people who are there and community members and places. So next, we talked about barriers to publication, potentially for Hawaii located authors or Hawaii based authors. We had that had this question of like, where is the funding going? Because we know, NSF, we know that there's funding going someplace, but how do we, what does it look like to overlay funding data on top of the publication data that we collected? So we looked at NSF data and found out that the majority of the NSF funded Hawaiian Islands coastal and marine research projects are still being conducted here in Hawaii. So that's just like these bigger pieces of the pie for marine and coastal here. And in fact, the distribution of NSF funding for Hawaiian Islands focused marine and coastal research project is also focused here in Hawaii. So researchers here are still receiving a majority of the funding for these types of research projects. So maybe there's some sort of like barrier to publication, to getting to that publication status, and what might those barriers be? Implications to this study and what we found out, the first big one is this loss of co-benefits. Co-benefits are expected outcomes of actions that positively and simultaneously impact a diverse range of stakeholders. And so for this study, that range of stakeholders, is our researchers, our community members, and some co-benefits that are lost if there are, this large number of externally based researchers who aren't, based in Hawaii, don't have connections to Hawaii, include this, broadening of knowledge for researchers and community members, equitable funding distribution, enhanced project capacity, the incorporation of local indigenous knowledge into science, but lots of important things that we lose in these cases. And so another one is another implication, and something that we worry about is, we all know in this room that science really has an impact in dictating public policy. And so if the science being done about a place is being done by people who aren't connected to that place, and then that impacts the policy, that creates a lot of issues. And then Deja at Sea Grant, I think that there are a lot of issues that this study sheds light on that I see people here at Sea Grant working on every day. And just to kind of recognize that Sea Grant is kind of uniquely positioned to tackle these issues, because you act as a liaison between scientists, between community members and government. And yeah, I hope that this can be incorporated or make an impact on the amazing work that you all do. So, sorry, here, where are we going? Future studies. This is just a little screenshot of my issue brief, or the issue brief that will be made available to everybody. But there are lots of things. Again, this is a high level study. There were a lot of ideas that came up throughout the course of the study of like, oh, we can do this and we can do that, but we really couldn't do it because we just had the 8 weeks, and hopefully somebody else can do it, or maybe I can come back and do it. The first is this idea of the abstracted acknowledgement search. This was something we kind of started doing at the beginning of my fellowship. I was like going through every research publication and their abstracts and their acknowledgements to see if they mentioned community-based work or community connections. So yeah, moving forward, something like that would be helpful, because I think with our methodology, we kind of did skip over, we probably included a lot of publications, or skipped over some that really were maybe, interacting with the community, but because they didn't have any Hawaiʻi-based authors, we skipped over that. So doing a little bit more in-depth search, a network analysis of the authors. We just want to know, if maybe we included a publication with a Hawaii-based author who just moved here, who actually just doesn't have connections, but they still count it as a Hawaii-based author because they're working out of a Hawaii zip code. So just kind of getting a better understanding of what the true network is of these authors. a mass data download from Google Scholar. I had a really hard time extracting metadata because I don't know, my computer was too old or there was just too much data. I think in the future, it'd be nice and really insightful to kind of work with the data that way, download it instead of kind of my method, which was really just kind of entering, going through, doing a search, entering, just to give us more insight. And then undertaking, yeah, similar analysis for other search terms, other types of research, especially like research that a Hawaii Sea Grant and SOEST is involved in. And then assessing, yeah, NSF funding in Hawaii to research versus non-research awards. So when you're looking at the NSF data, we also did kind of this like higher level analysis, but there were questions of like, okay, maybe there's all of this money coming in from NSF, but that doesn't mean that it's all going towards scientific research. It could be going towards education or outreach projects, that kind of thing. So that would be important to look at in the future. Next. So now just my reflection. I think that throughout all of our the field trips, the wonderful field trips that we were able to do through this program and the experience of going through this study, the biggest takeaway for me, or the most significant one, is that long-term investments in place and in community are just truly necessary and matter at every step of the way and every step of this process of coastal rehabilitation and remediation, whether it's long-term investment in research, development, landscape planning, community involvement, engagement. Those investments result in places and the care of places like Kanama Bay, where Peter Rappa's legacy really lives on. And it's a place we had the pleasure of going to with Melanie. We really saw that community members are showing up every day to take care of the land, to share knowledge, to engage visitors, and help them understand that their presence in the bay means that they're responsible for the connection between their actions, the health of the bay, and the health of the community. And yeah, I think that's just kind of been my biggest takeaway from my time this summer. And that again too, like that nobody's work exists in a vacuum. Everybody here, everyone sitting in here who's involved with the Hawaii Sea Grant or as an affiliate, everyone is constantly working together and comes into their work with this understanding that what they do every day is going to have an implication for a colleague or a community member. And that was just super special for me. And so I just want to end by saying mahalo Hawaii Sea Grant, mahalo to my advisors, my mentors, and to my fellows, Joel and Des. We really had a blast this summer together, I have to say. And it's just the cherry on top. So thank you all. And I am ready to take questions.
Okay, let's take a couple questions from the audience. And if you're online, you can enter your question into the chat. Any questions in the room for Sarah? Hal?
I got a little confused at the beginning. I guess Hawaiian researchers are ones whose zip codes appear in the publication somewhere. Is that the idea?
Yes.
And did you subtract those from the total that you found?
Yes, exactly. Mhm.
My question.
Thank you.
Other questions for Sarah?
I'll ask a question, Sarah.
Yeah.
So I'm like overwhelmed by what you found. I'm pretty shocked that the majority of the publications on Hawaiian Islands, coastal research, Hawaiian Islands, marine research, none of the authors have an affiliation with an institution here in Hawaii. Pretty blown away by that. Considering that that's our current circumstance, like, do you have ideas on how to facilitate better connectivity of those continental-based researchers, or I don't know if they're like even in other countries across the world? Like, how do we facilitate lessons learned, application of those research results back to the places in Hawaii, considering that the majority are not here?
Totally, no,
That's
that's
kind of a big question.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's an important one. I think, I don't have a perfect answer to it, but I think like looking at something like the Kuloa Loi out of the Ike Center is the beginning of that answer, is like fostering this culture where externally based authors, if we can get to the point where an externally based author says, step one of my, conducting this research or even conceptualizing this research is to connect with somebody who's there, to connect with the research. Even, it doesn't have to be necessarily even community. It can just be somebody from like an institution, an academic institution on that place, and fostering a connection first, and then, forming the study around that. If we can get to that place, I think things would be better. But it's just up to us to kind of create those curriculum and create those paths.
The question online?
Kanisa has a question. Kanisa, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, absolutely. Super wonderful presentation. Okay, good. I was doubling myself there for a second. I'm curious if, I know you talked a little bit about the metadata, but if you were able to look at any trends in the type of publications that were coming out from researchers located in Hawaii versus researchers located elsewhere. For example, like, was there more field work in Hawaii, or more long-term research, or just data-based? Because the difference was so extreme. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Kanisa. So for our Google Scholar searches, I wasn't able to do that level of analysis, but I know that I'm pretty sure that the NSF data does get to that granularity. Like, it does tell you what type of research is happening. It does give you like funding dates. So the beginning of the funding and the end date funding. So that could be something that hopefully that, continues, that there is a future study. But so right now for Google Scholar, I don't think, unless, maybe if you download that data, it would tell you that, but I couldn't get to that level.
Other questions for Sarah? Brad?
Real general question. I never thought about this like research, but how does Google compile all these publications? Are they pulling from all these other databases?
That's a good question. I don't know that I know the answer.
You can Google
Yeah.
But you mentioned that you could be missing stuff from other
Yeah.
databases. You got a sense that at least.
I think so. Yeah, I found this other research study that was just purely about like these databases and how much they actually cover. Maybe that paper has the information that I just glossed over, but it does feel like, even though we picked up a lot of publications, I just feel like I have to put together more than this.
We'll take the last question from Amy. Thanks, Amy.
This is real general also. So you talked about the percentage of the NSF funded research on Hawaii that is being conducted in Hawaii. Did you also look at the percentage, or what percentage of NSF funding as a whole goes to?
As a whole, meaning like as a whole under this like Hawaiian Research Coastal and Marine, that search.
Yeah, but how much of NSF's overall research funding is focused on Hawaiian Islands?
No, I did not look at that. Thank you for that question.
I don't know what this is. Seems like probably something
Yeah.
in there.
No, definitely. Thank you for that question.
Another round of applause for Sarah. Let's bring Melanie Lander to the front. She's going to introduce our next speaker while I get the next. Whatever you like, the layer on the computer ready for you. Just a moment. You can start talking while I mess with this.
Okay, sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Melanie Lander, and I was Des's mentor this summer, along with Wendy Maguro, who's joining us online today. We Actually, Sarah set me up perfectly. I couldn't have planned the order better because we have been working in Hawaii, by Hawaii and for Hawaii to determine what global sea level rise adaptation strategies apply and are locally relevant here, and specifically in Waikīkī. And this research has been going on for a while before I joined the team. And Wendy expressed an interest in publicizing the outcomes of this research in order to inform policy and potentially create new guidelines as a result of the research outcomes. And so we were interested in having a Rappa fellow work with us because we weren't really sure where to start with publicizing our data and our research outcomes. And so Des has been working with us this summer and has done a really incredible job in putting together what we call a media kit. And it hopefully will be a one-stop shop for media outlets from Hawaii News Now to Hawaii Public Radio to grab on to the outcomes of the project and hopefully disseminate them to the community and to decision makers and other interested professionals like the building industry. So this summer, Des has helped us by creating this resource, and she has really amazed us with her graphical abilities. She's an architect and a really, really fast worker. And I gave her a few ideas for prompts. And the next day or in a couple of days, she had something for me to look at. And it was a really wonderful opportunity to get to work with her. So I just want to thank her for all of her hard work and contributions to the project. And I welcome her up here to share her outcomes with you. Thank you. Thank you. I like your hair, by the way.
So thank you, Melanie, for introducing me. Aloha and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Des, and thank you for spending your afternoon here with us to support Sarah, Joel, and I. So we'll go ahead and jump right into my project, which is to create a media kit for Wendy McGurl's research project on envisioning in-place adaptation strategies for Waikīkī's densely developed coastal community. So I'd like to start off by showing you the snapshot from the State of Hawaii Sea Level Rise viewer online. And as you can see that the blue represents the sea level rise exposure. And this is with 3.2 feet of sea level rise. And with a close look at Waikīkī, we can see the impacts of climate change in this community. And it will definitely affect the tourism industry. So why is the focus on Waikīkī and what makes Waikīkī so important? It's not a surprise that Waikīkī is the hottest tourist destination in Honolulu, and it's the economic hub of the tourism industry here in Hawaii. So with its close proximity to the ocean, Waikīkī is going to be naturally vulnerable to flooding from sea level rise, high wave events, high tide flooding, and heavy rainfall. And according to the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Vulnerability and Adaptation Report, they estimated a total of 19 billion future loss in land and structures. So flooding in Waikīkī and throughout the islands have already made its appearance here. So we've seen sea level rise enter our communities through flooding from our drainage systems, groundwater inundation, and as sea level rises, so will the water table. And in Waikīkī, all it takes is 2 feet of sea level rise until the drylands start to turn into wetlands. And with the combination of groundwater inundation and storm drain backflow with heavy rainfall events, we end up with extreme flooding because there's no place for the runoff to go to or drain from, which is why it's important to start thinking about how we can protect our communities and begin to discuss potential future flood adaptation strategies that is applicable to Waikīkī, because this community is too important to immediately retreat from sea level rise. So as a response, Wendy and her team with Hawaii Sea Grant and the UH Manoa School of Architecture has been exploring in-place adaptation strategies to address sea level rise in Waikīkī. This interdisciplinary team has been reviewing emerging flood resilience guides and case studies to inform and help the project methodology. And with the latest SOS sea level science, they were able to create a site selection criteria to identify kind of like low-rise residential, commercial, retail, hospitality buildings at risk of flooding. In preparation for this workshop, they selected 2 sites to reimagine for sea level rise scenarios in the years 2050 and 2100. And they solicited feedback from a wide range of local stakeholders with the goal of identifying flood adaptation strategies relevant to Waikīkī. So for those workshops, the strategies that were deemed by the stakeholders to be relevant to Waikīkī were applied by graduate students to architectural renderings shown here to re-envision 2 sites in Waikīkī. The first site, they applied strategies for 2100 for buildings are repurposing at-grade spaces, elevating exterior circulation, relocating critical systems, and collecting rainwater. For transportation and utility strategies applied here are raising streetscapes, vaulted utilities, elevated critical equipment, underground and below grade water storage, and biofiltration. And in the second site, the applied strategies for 2100 for buildings are to elevate on open foundation, elevating interior and exterior circulation, relocating critical systems, and below grade water storage. And these site-specific applications of flood adaptation strategies were presented to expert panelists in 2022, in which they discussed the advantages and the disadvantages of the strategy as they apply to each site. So the next steps for the project team is to assess adaptation strategies to a beachfront condominium located on Kalia Road with 3 new graduate assistants, an architect, a landscape architect student, and then a local processes student or coastal processes student. With this new set of graduate fellows, they will create flood adaptation renderings focusing on streetscape, open space, and shoreline adaptations, and will continue to explore in-place adaptation strategies for the Waikīkī community. Okay, so we'll go into my role as a Rappa fellow this summer. I basically had the opportunity to create a media kit for this project, and my role was to create a collection of materials that I thought would be relevant to the media organizations and create effective communication strategies so that we can get this information out of the university silo and basically to get it out into the public, because it's amazing research being done by Hawaiʻi Sea Grant and the School of Architecture, and not only deserves recognition, but also to encourage the development of new design guidelines, flood mitigation policy, and to pilot projects. So as a Rappa fellow, my goal was to educate myself on what a media kit was and how to create an effective media kit so that it's easy to understand and easy to navigate. And secondly, I had to figure out what materials I needed to approach media organizations that would compel them to write a story on the project. And lastly, what type of graphics can I include in a media kit for social media postings? So you've heard me say media kit many times now. So yeah, what is a media kit? Essentially, a media kit is a collection of promotional materials that would help journalists and bloggers write articles about this project. And the purpose of the media kit is to make the reporter's job a lot easier when they're provided with everything they need to know about the project, especially in an accessible format such as Google Drive or Dropbox. And with the help of the media kit, reporters can have all the information they need just in one drive. And there were many ways to go about how to create a media kit, but specifically for this project, I found that the easiest way was through Google Drive, and it can be accessible through the public by a click of a link, and everything a journalist needs is divided into the folders. So for this project's media kit, we decided on 4 major folders that would hold the project's social media assets. One is for social media assets that I redesigned for Instagram postings, and then graphics and photos that would have any of the visualizations or team photos, team headshots, logos and stuff like that. And then we also have the press release and products. And now I want to share with you some of the few things that I've been working on over the course of this fellowship, starting with the press release. So I learned that the press release is crucial in the media world when you're trying to get media coverage for a project. And thanks to Cindy, if she's here. Yeah, Cindy, who is our communications leader here at Hawaii Sea Grant, she was able to share her knowledge with me. And yeah, basically what the press release is an official statement that provides a little bit of a teaser of what the project is about. It is meant to be concise and shows just a glimpse of what the project is. That is enough to pique the interest of journalists, and the press release is kind of where the media kit link would live, because the media kit is to target reporters and get them to write a story for us. And then in this press release, I also included the link to the project site to give them more information about the research and give them access to previous workshops, sites, webinars, and stakeholder feedbacks. The next thing a journalist would come across in the media kit is this 2-page project summary that live under the products tab. And what this 2-page summary is that it basically encapsulates the relevancy of this project, what the project has accomplished so far, their goals for this effort, renderings that reimagine 2050 and 2100, and then with flood adaptation strategies and what their next steps are. So as part of the effort to disseminate this research to the public, creating social media posts was important, because in this generation, social media is very important because it's powerful. It's a very powerful tool to get information out there and to educate people. And hopefully with this effort, we are able to reach a wider audience. And the goal for this is to showcase the flood adaptation strategies that are specific to Waikīkī. And one of the biggest things when creating the social media post is to make sure that it's aesthetically pleasing, because naturally, if a post is nice, more people will take the time to swipe through each post and kind of take that information in. So with that, I redesigned some adaptation strategies from the team to create a set that is for the everyday audience to easily digest. So the first set of social media posts are the flood adaptation strategies related to buildings. For this set, I really tried to highlight the adaptation strategy that I used in each square in this bright orange color to differentiate what is existing and what the strategy looks like in drawing. And the first building adaptation strategy is to elevate on an open foundation, which means a building can be elevated on piles, piers, posts, or columns. And the second adaptation is elevating on fill by using appropriate structural fill to compact the site. And then the third adaptation is elevating exterior circulation, which means to elevate the first floor and provide ramps or stairs or walkways. And then the fourth adaptation is elevating interior circulation to protect the first floor from flood risk. And then the fifth adaptation strategy is to repurpose below grade spaces, which are spaces previously used for parking or storage that can be wet flood proofed. And the sixth adaptation is to relocate critical systems to, again, protect them from flood risk. And the seventh is to wet flood proof, which basically means is to allow flood waters to enter the enclosed space or area to quickly reach the same level as the flood waters outside to reduce pressure. And the eighth strategy is to dry flood proof to prevent the entry of flood waters. And the last building adaptation strategy explored by the team is to build with flood resistant materials to avoid any significant damages from flooding. And in this second set of social media posts for flood adaptation strategies is related to transportation and open space and utilities. And again, I tried to highlight the adaptation strategy in that bright orange color so that it's easier to understand what information that graphic is trying to deliver. The first strategy is raising streetscape to control flooding and maximize the usability of roads for evacuation, emergency response, and general mobility during flood events. And then the second is resilient streetscape, which is to include amenities like flood-resistant plantings, sidewalks, seatings, and trees. And the third strategy is cisterns and water collection. The fourth is floodable open spaces, which are designed spaces that provide both function and flood retention. And the fifth strategy is ecological water treatment, such as rain gardens or bioswales. And then the sixth is to protect and replace city utilities, and lastly, incorporating below grade water storage where water can be collected and temporarily detained or stored within the system for a period of time during heavy rainfall events. So my method for creating the first 2 sets of social media posts is through this Adobe Suite app called Illustrator. And I referred back to the icons that the project team had already created, and just creating a simple and cohesive set of graphics, and made sure to stick to the same color palette and using kind of the same level of detail for each adaptation strategy. And then lastly, I created this visualization of all flood adaptation strategies applied. This model is not necessarily a specific area in Waikīkī, like the renderings that were created by the graduate fellows in previous slides, but what I had hoped for this graphic is to provide a visual of all of the flood adaptation strategies that the team has explored specific to Waikīkī so far, and give the audience an idea of what that adaptation strategy might look like in action. So to our far left, we have the Alawai Canal, and then some of the first few things that we see, or first few strategies that we see is the raised streetscape, the ecological water treatment, and resilient streetscape, which are strategies related to transportation and open space. And as we process the visual or the graphic, we start to see adaptation strategies in action, like what it means to elevate on fill or repurposing spaces that are below grade or underground. So yeah, ultimately the goal of this visualization is to help those who are unfamiliar with the terms that are being used to see what they look like and kind of give them a better understanding of what those terms mean. And my process for creating this visual began with a lot of brainstorming and sketching to figure out how I can showcase all 16 flood adaptation strategies. And I found that the best way to do this was a section cut that shows both below grade spaces and at grade spaces. And I decided that the model should look like it belongs in Waikīkī somehow. And a way to establish that was to include the Alawai Canal. And from there, I decided to split the building adaptations between 2 buildings, one that is elevated on fill and the other that is elevated on open foundation. And then I decided to keep the center of those 2 buildings open in order to apply open space adaptation strategies like floodable open spaces. And after going through multiple sketches and ideas, I used a modeling software called Rhino and another software called Enscape, which is a virtual reality plugged in. And then I took snapshots from that. And then I photoshopped everything else to create the final product. Yeah, that basically sums up the collection of materials that I created for this project's media kit, which is available to the public via Google Drive. And working on the media kit for this project has definitely helped me out tremendously as an architecture student. And it's great to be able to carry this knowledge with me forward as a designer going into my final year in my undergrad. Okay. So yeah, now I'd like to spend this time reflecting on the past 8 weeks here at Hawaiʻi Sea Grant. This summer has been one of the most fulfilling experiences yet, I would say, from going on field trips with our extension agents and browsing through Hawaiʻi Sea Grant website. And it really allowed me to learn the impacts of sea level rise, not just on Hawaii's coast, but the entire community as a whole. The program helped me realize the severity of rising sea levels in our state and has definitely sparked something in me to continue to learn more about how we can protect our communities. And every field trip we've gone on, every time I kicked my slippers off and kind of was barefoot and felt the dirt and the sand and the ocean, I felt connected to the Aina, and it allowed me to dig deeper into why I am a Rappa Fellow. And as a Rappa Fellow, I hope to continue to contribute to Peter's work and keeping his legacy alive. And yeah, as an architecture student here in Hawaii, the fellowship has helped me view design in a totally different lens. And I'm glad it did, because I'm eager to learn more about how I can help contribute to Hawaii's journey to sustainability and build coastal resiliency through architecture and design. So lastly, I would like to say my thank yous. I would like to say thank you to Wendy McGurrow, who was my professor last fall, where I got to reimagine Koala Basin in the year 2100, and she was the one who introduced me to coastal issues and to Hawaiʻi Sea Grant. Thank you to Melanie for guiding me throughout this entire process and always hyping up my work and then giving me the freedom to bring my creativity into this project and this effort. And then special thanks to Cindy for sharing some tips for the press release, and Heather for giving me some graphic feedback for the media kit. And of course, I want to say thank you to Maya for your endless encouragement and for checking in on us to make sure that we're still sane and like popping into the office every once in a while. Thank you to Eileen for welcoming us into your office and being there whenever we needed help and had questions. And of course, thank you to everyone at Sea Grant or Hawaiʻi Sea Grant for being so kind and just making this experience that much more memorable. And then lastly, thank you to Joel and Sarah for making our work trips to Kauai and Maui memorable. I'm gonna miss our lunch dates and ranting sessions. And then, yeah, thank you for being part of my growth this summer. Mahalo nui loa.
Let's take some questions for Des. If you are online, you can enter your question in the chat. And if you're in the room, you can raise your hand. Questions for Des? I'll get us started. When I see your designs and your renderings, I want to live in the future where we are adapted to these climate change impacts because it's so beautiful. And what's my question? I guess my question is like, how can people from the natural sciences work more hand in hand with architects, designers, so that we can design beautiful spaces for communities to live in?
I definitely think that it should start within the university. I think right now, with Wendy being one of our professors at the university at the School of Architecture in Manoa, like she definitely helped me come into like this type of work. And I think more people like Wendy kind of needs to come into the School of Architecture more so that we can collaborate, because architecture and the environment is like, should not be like two different things. They should be one thing, and like, yeah, architecture should live in the environment kind of like cohesively. And yeah.
Question from Beth.
Speaking of Wendy, Wendy has a question.
Oh, great. Wendy, do you want to unmute your microphone and ask your question?
Sure, I would love to. First of all, excellent presentation, Desiree. Thank you for your amazing mentorship, Melanie. And I also, I want to give a few shout outs, and then I do have a real question, but I would like to recognize the large research team that we have. Desiree and Melanie were very kind in mentioning my name, but there are many, many people behind this. So co-PI Chip Fletcher, Sea Grant Fellows, Ireland Castillo, and Josephine Briones. So you see the Sea Grant thread here. New graduate research assistants, Eric Teeples and Jerry Bailano, climate resilience specialist, Georgina Casey, and then our own Sea Grant staff, Eileen Peppard and Dolan Eversole, as well as the whole support team that you already mentioned. And so, yes, thank you to all of those. And Darren mentioned in the beginning, thank you to Office of Naval Research Climate Resilience Initiative. My question is that our goal was to share this design research with the public in general, but I'm particularly interested in how we cultivate the next generation of professionals in these, or cultivate their interest in these topics of sustainability and resilience. So Desiree, now you've kind of seen that from two lenses, being a student yourself, and then also from the vantage point of trying to communicate the work in a way that is appealing to others. Do you have ideas about how we can best reach that next generation of professionals?
Yeah, I think going back to what I said, I think everything starts with education, and with us in the university level, it's kind of great to have like having partnerships with like Hawaiʻi Sea Grant and
Yeah, but bringing those next generation professionals into the fold, how can we best reach them?
I do think it's hard to convince people that this is an important space to be in professionally. What's the hook?
I think reading the stakeholder feedback report, there definitely is like a lot of positives and negatives to, or there is a lot of concern with kind of adapting to sea level rise. A lot of people are kind of like saying there is going to be bigger events that's going to come through before sea level rise. And yeah, it takes a lot of convincing, but I feel like by getting this information out into the public, that can start to move the discussion a little forward. Yeah.
Cool.
I just wanted to say thank you for all your hard work on this. Amazing.
Thank you.
Having been part of the project since its inception, it's really rewarding to see how far it's come. From what started out as kind of an ambitious design charrette is now turning into something bigger than that. So thank you for being part of that. And I had a thought, which is Wendy's question about how do we continue this and gain attention or interest from students. One way that's commonly done is design competitions, to do something similar to what we're doing, put it out there and take what we've done and then have engineers look at it and go, well, wait, no, you can't build it like that. It's got to be different. So that's one idea. The other, I just wanted to comment on, most of you or some of you may not know that there is funding now to do a Waikīkī resilience plan. And it's going through the School of Architecture to develop a plan for Waikīkī. And these type of drawings and design charrettes are going to be crucial for how we communicate these type of approaches. So if we're going to develop a plan, people are going to say, what does a raised street look like? And we're going to immediately go to your graphics and go, here's what it could look like. So the timing of this is really exceptional. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Another round of applause for. Let's bring Shelley Hable up to the front. She's going to introduce our third and final speaker today. Just gotta get this. You can start talking while I'm messing with this.
Yeah, I'm Shelley Hable. I'm a coastal researcher with UHC Grant and the Climate Resilience Initiative. And I'm really proud to introduce Joel Burgess. Joel is entering his third year at Richardson School of Law, where he serves as a research associate for the law school's environmental law program. He also double majored in philosophy and music during his undergraduate degree here at UH. And then adding to that pedigree, he worked with Stuart Coleman's VI initiative on cesspool conversion. And then we were super happy to have him over at the Coastal Geology Group over this summer. And we tried to rope him into as much field work as we possibly could to try to convert him to come over to the coastal geology science realm. And given a little bit more time, I think we would have done it. But we're really happy to have you over there. So today he's here to tell you about his work as part of the Rappa Fellowship doing introductory development of an educational credits program for local realtors regarding use of the state sea level rise viewer, as well as other coastal hazards. And he also did some brainstorming, really important brainstorming regarding future legislation that could really tighten up real estate disclosures in the future on the topic of coastal hazards. So again, Joel, it was a real pleasure. Thank you again for joining us as part of Rappa.
Good job.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Joel, for those of you that I haven't met yet. And my project's called Implementing Act 179, Educating Home Buyers on Climate Change and Coastal Hazards. So the coastline near Sunset Beach, where this house collapsed, has been plagued by erosion issues since at least 2018. Houses along this area now are frequently change hands and are sold to new owners. Since 2018, when the erosion became critical, 5 houses along a stretch of 15 impacted houses have been sold to new owners, with one house in particular shifting owners 4 times since 2018, so 4 times in 4 years. It's become clear that the property sales have become an avenue for homeowners to mitigate their losses and in some cases escape a steadily worsening legal situation due to the implementation of unauthorized erosion mitigation activities. While sale of these impacted properties solves the problem for the original homeowner, the problem doesn't go away. It passes the problem on to the new homeowner and can complicate the regulation of coastal land use being conducted by local government. And this issue isn't just specific to the North Shore of Oahu. This issue affects the whole state. So in response to some of these issues, the state legislature passed Act 179 in the 2021 legislative session, and that act amends Hawaii Revised Statute Chapter 508D and requires that prospective buyers be informed if a property lies within a sea level rise exposure area as identified by the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Vulnerability and Adaptation Report anytime a residential property is sold or transferred. As a Rappa fellow, I looked into this issue of real estate disclosure and sea level rise and why they're so crucial to ensuring a fair deal in real estate transactions. My project involves drafting recommendations for Sea Grant to offer continuing education courses, and my project seeks to provide solutions for this problem by creating a path for Hawaii Sea Grant to follow in order to provide continuing education courses for real estate professionals. Additionally, I also developed policy ideas for how to disclose other coastal hazards other than sea level rise. Thanks to the many field trips and site visits we were able to participate in this summer, I realized that sea level rise isn't the only coastal hazard threatening beachfront residences in Hawaii. Issues like flooding, cesspools, and shoreline hardening structures also have major implications and impacts in real estate transactions. So as a Rappa fellow, I drafted some recommendations for updates to current disclosure laws that will help ensure fairness in real estate transactions. So here's the roadmap for today's presentation. First, I'll talk a little bit about why disclosures are important. Then we'll move on to current disclosure requirements in Hawaii. And then we'll get into what I spent a lot of time on this summer, which is drafting recommendations for realtor, continuing education workshops, and then finally, ideas for future disclosure policies. Why are disclosures important? Disclosures are important in all parts of life: real estate transactions, securities trading and investments, informed consent and medical procedures, car sales, et cetera, et cetera. Overall, the purpose of sellers disclosing information to buyers is to give the buyer an informed choice whether to accept or decline the seller's offer. Oops. Further, buyers that are aware of such risks cannot later claim ignorance regarding the information that was earlier disclosed to them. These disclosures serve as documentation that the buyer knew of the inherent risks in their purchase and still decided to go through with it anyway. And I have a quick example of why these disclosures are really important, especially in the context of real estate transactions. This is an ad for a really big mansion on West Maui, listed for $9.5 million. And as the photos make the house seem like it's a really nice beachfront property that you can enjoy life on for a really long time. But then when you look at these photos fronting the property, you can see all kinds of issues, mainly the seawall that is in urgent need of a repair. So this highlights why disclosures are important, because the seller might not tell the buyer about this issue on the property, and then the seller might end up getting more money than they should have because the buyer is more willing to pay more money. Just narrowing down this issue a little bit more, purchasing a house is a lifelong investment, and given that the average price for a home in Hawaii is now around $1 million, it's often the biggest purchase a person will make in their lifetime. So if these coastal hazards get disclosed before the transfer of ownership, then the new owner won't be able to later claim later on that this deal was unfair to them or that they didn't know about issue X because the seller didn't tell them, and that in a way protects the city and state from upset home buyers later down the road. Before I get into what is currently required in Hawaii, I want to talk just really briefly about caveat emptor, which is a common law doctrine made several centuries ago and has worked its way into the American court system. Caveat emptor literally translates to buyer beware, and it places the burden of inspection of the property on the buyer rather than the seller. It's grounded on the premise that sellers and buyers have equal bargaining power, equal skill, and equal experience. So under that premise, each party to the transaction is only responsible to themselves and only looking out for themselves. If the buyer wants protection for their purchase of the property, then the buyer has to bargain for an explicit warranty. And what's really important that I want everybody to get from this slide is that caveat emptor is more seller friendly and places extra burdens on the buyer. There is an exception that would shield sellers from liability if they don't disclose information, and that's when buyers have an opportunity to inspect their premises before purchasing. But as I mentioned earlier, this doctrine has been largely restricted by common law and state statutes. It was developed several centuries ago when real estate purchasing practices were very different from today. It was developed at a time when buyers had equal bargaining power as sellers, but today, however, sellers are in a better position to prevent unfair property transactions. So the burden should really be on the seller to disclose the hazards on their property. And that's what Act 179 does. Act 179 amends Hawaii-based statute 508D and requires disclosure statements for whether the residential real property lies within a sea level rise exposure area under 3.2 feet of sea level rise. And 3.2 is not just some arbitrary number that lawmakers downtown came up with. It's based on a lot of things such as the Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Report, as well as the UN IPCC report, and it also aligns with NOAA sea level rise projections. Prior to 2021, the legislative bills similar to Act 179 failed to pass the state legislature in part due to some issues with the sea level rise viewer that I'll touch on in the next slide. Sea grant extension agents like Dr. Brad Romine and Dr. Shelley Habel worked with realtors to make the viewer more user-friendly. Ultimately, these updates to the viewer gave peace of mind to lawmakers and realtors that there would be a reliable way to see which coastal properties are going to be vulnerable to sea level rise. Now, you might be wondering, how does the government expect realtors to comply with Act 179? And the answer is through the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Viewer. When the legislature passed Act 179 last summer, lawmakers delayed the enforcement of this law until May of 2022, so just a few months ago. And that was to allow time for realtors to educate themselves on how to use the viewer and adapt their various disclosure forms to comply with this new law. To further assist realtors, Sea Grant Extension agents conducted multiple workshops showcasing the viewer and its special features that can assist realtors in determining whether their property lies within a sea level rise exposure area. Sea Grant also partnered with the Hawaii State Climate Commission to produce a brief educational document to aid realtors in effectively relaying this sea level rise information. The viewer is based on the sea level rise modeling results published as part of the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Vulnerability and Adaptation Report. As included as part of the viewer documentation, the methods used to produce sea level rise exposure area simulations have been peer reviewed and are accordingly considered a reliable and useful tool, accurate enough to be used in land management decisions, and it contains the best available information as of December 2017. And just one quick thing that I want to highlight on this viewer as it relates to Act 179 are these kind of legal gray areas where, you see this? Right here, where only certain portions of the property are affected by sea level rise. It raises a question of whether the seller has to disclose the vulnerability to sea level rise when they sell their house to the buyer. And the answer to that question is it depends, like most law questions. If the seller in good faith can determine that only such a small percentage of their property is going to be affected by sea level rise, that it doesn't have any material effect on the value of the house, and they don't necessarily have to disclose that information. So now that I talked about what the law is and how to comply with it, I want to talk about what I worked on specifically with Sea Grant this summer. I put most of my energy into two main projects. First, I drafted recommendations for how Hawaii Sea Grant can move forward in offering continuing education courses for realtors in Hawaii. To do that, I interviewed other Sea Grant branches that are already offering continuing education courses for realtors, and also met and interviewed local real estate professionals to gauge industry interest and figure out what topics are important for them to learn about. The second project that I focused a lot of my energy on this summer involves drafting policies for disclosure laws on coastal hazards other than sea level rise. To draft these recommendations, I took what I learned from site visits on North Shore, Maui, Hawaii, and other places, and then researched the coastal hazards that we observed at those sites. I also talked with researchers at SOWEST, including Dr. Chip Fletcher and Colin Lee. And after that, I researched local laws in both the Hawaii revised statutes and Hawaii administrative rules to figure out what specific information should be disclosed to buyers. So for the first project, I'm recommending 3 action items for Hawaii Sea Grant. The first is to offer continuing education courses for realtors, and I'll get into how Sea Grant can do that on the next few slides. Some tangential recommendations I also came up with was to work with the William S. Richardson School of Law to provide continuing legal education courses, and to also update the UH Sea Grant Coastal Real Estate Guide, which was last updated in 2006. Developing these continuing education workshops for real estate professionals can take a lot of time, energy, and resources. Luckily, however, Sea Grant does not need to start totally from scratch, because other Sea Grant programs on the continental US already offer these continuing education courses for real estate professionals. So for example, South Carolina Sea Grant has their Calling the Coast Home workshop series, which features 4 2-hour-long courses that realtors in South Carolina can count towards their continuing education requirements. And Lake Champlain has a similar program with 8 1-hour-long workshops that are available to realtors in Vermont and portions of Western New York. When I interviewed people at both of these Sea Grant branches, they agreed and stressed that the most important thing to keep in mind when developing these continuing education workshops is to have active dialogue and active conversations with realtors in the community, so realtors in Hawaii. And that's really important because we don't want to be creating material for people that they don't really necessarily need. Here are some topics that I thought would be good to cover in these workshops, but again, it would be really important to have these dialogues with local realtors and local real estate professionals to make sure that this information is actually what they're looking for. So first would be an introduction to Act 179 and the need for sea level rise disclosures. In this kind of workshop, I would imagine it being similar to the sessions provided by Sea Grant extension agents regarding how to use the sea level rise viewer as it relates to 179 and potential ambiguities in the sea level rise viewer that I mentioned earlier. Another potential workshop would be about coastal hazards in Hawaii, which would be focused on understanding hazards represented by sea level rise, such as coastal erosion, high wave runup, and passive and inland flooding. Another good topic to cover would be sewage treatment systems in Hawaii and considerations regarding erosion and high coastal groundwater levels. This kind of workshop could focus on cesspool conversion options and potential sources of funding for converting your cesspool, and additionally determining what type of sewer or septic system is best suited for any given property. And the last idea I had for these workshops was permitting requirements needed for coastal development. And I think this workshop in particular could transfer pretty easily over into continuing legal education workshops, because a lot of what will be discussed in that workshop with permitting has a lot to do with the law that attorneys would find really useful. So these are the 3 steps that I've broken down how Hawaii Sea Grant can be qualified to start offering these continuing education courses for realtors. Number 1, the course must be certified by the State of Hawaii Real Estate Commission. The commission will consider several factors in approving and certifying the proposed course. The proposed course has to be designed for an approved purpose, such as protecting the general public in real estate transactions. Additionally, there must be clearly defined course objectives and specific student performance learning outcomes, similar to what you would see in a college syllabus. The course has to also be delivered live, and that can be in person or on Zoom, run for at least 3 hours, and issue a certificate of completion at the end of the course. So basically, the commission will approve and certify the content of a course if the course efficiently conveys valuable information to the audience. Number 2 isn't a big worry for Hawaii Sea Grant. That's mostly up to the real estate commission, and just all they would need to do is assign this course a course number. This third option is more tricky though. Prior to offering continuing education courses for real estate professionals, Hawaii Sea Grant will need to apply and register as a continuing education provider. To apply as a provider, Sea Grant will need to submit their application to the Hawaii Real Estate Commission. And in that application, they would just provide basic contact information for Sea Grant faculty that would be running the program, an attendance policy, and just other general information that will help the commission to decide whether to qualify Sea Grant as a continuing education provider. Luckily, Hawaii Sea Grant is part of the University of Hawaii system, which is already approved by the State Council of Post-Secondary Education. So the application fees to register as a provider could possibly be waived. Another alternative to registering Sea Grant as a provider is to outsource the instruction of the course to an already certified provider, such as the Honolulu Board of Realtors. One potential wrinkle and hurdle to that plan, though, is that the minimum length requirement for continuing education courses for realtors is 3 hours. And it may be more difficult to train an instructor on 3 hours worth of content than to just register Hawaii Sea Grant as a provider, which again, that registration fee could be waived. So these are my other two tangential recommendations and action items for Sea Grant. Number one is to work with the William S. Richardson School of Law to provide continuing legal education courses. And as I've been mentioning, I think that's a good idea because a lot of the content that we're going to produce for these realtor continuing education workshops are easily transferable to what lawyers need to know. And lawyers have similar requirements regarding continuing education requirements. The law school is already a licensed CLE provider, so Sea Grant can partner up with the law school and skip the whole provider registration process for CLE credits. And my last action item is to update the Coastal Real Estate Guide. That brochure really contains a lot of useful information, both on federal, state, and local laws. And a lot of those laws have changed since 2006. But once all that information is updated, it'd be a really good resource to hand out at all of our continuing education courses. So now moving on to the latter half of my presentation, I'm going to talk about other coastal hazards to residential real property other than sea level rise. And a lot of these coastal hazards that I'm about to discuss already have disclosure requirements in Hawaii, but I'm arguing that these disclosures don't convey all of the necessary information that a buyer would expect. So the first issue that I think should be disclosed is flood zones. In Hawaii, homeowners are only required to disclose whether the property lies within a FEMA designated flood zone. And that's a really good start. But when you compare that law to other states that have really comprehensive flood disclosure laws like Louisiana, you can start to see where Hawaii's laws start to fall a bit short. In Louisiana, in addition to disclosing whether the property is located in a FEMA flood zone, sellers also have to disclose whether flood insurance on the property is required to obtain federal financing on their mortgage, whether there is a current flood insurance policy on the home, and if so, the price of that insurance. And sellers also have to disclose past flooding events that have affected the property, any past insurance claims that they have filed, any disaster-related aid received from FEMA or another emergency management agency, as well as any flood elevation certificates. Cesspools are another coastal hazard that I think should be required to be disclosed. And for those that don't know, cesspools are essentially just holes in the ground that capture household wastewater, and they're not very good for the environment. I got to learn a lot about cesspools in my work with VI last summer, Wastewater Alternatives Innovations. And there I learned that in 2017, the legislature passed Act 25, which mandates that all cesspools in Hawaii have to be converted by the year 2050. So now cesspools are one of these hidden costs of buying a home. And here I have the standard disclosure form from the Hawaii Association of Realtors. And as you can see, the standard disclosure form does indicate whether there is a cesspool on the property, but there's no indication that the cesspool has to be converted or upgraded before 2050. Also, it doesn't disclose how costly it is to replace a cesspool, which can easily run into the tens of thousands of dollars. Without disclosure of these cesspool issues, a buyer is paying more than fair market value for the home. Failing to disclose cesspool information to the buyer also harms the environment because if the buyer delays and procrastinates upgrading their cesspool, then the cesspool continues to damage the surrounding environment. The last coastal issue that I want to talk about is shoreline hardening structures and how they affect their property boundaries. In order to prevent the loss of private property, some homeowners residing in Hawaii's coastlines have begun to install shoreline hardening structures, sometimes without the required permit. In 2020, the state legislature passed Act 16 to amend the Hawaii Coastal Zone Management Act with new policies that include a general aversion to shoreline hardening structures on sand beaches. Now, these artificial hardening structures are really successful at slowing backshore land loss and protecting these private residences in the backshore, but their use has resulted in widespread beach loss among all of the Hawaiian Islands. Installation of these structures is a violation of state law and violations of the Coastal Zone Management Act. These violations apply to each individual property and not necessarily those homeowners that originally performed the violation. So violations running with the property means that these uninformed buyers will bear the burden of paying civil fines for the illegal structures on their property, even when the buyer had no idea that the structure existed at the time of sale. So here's some more examples of how destructive and bad these shoreline hardening structures can be. You can see how it disrupts the high wash of the waves and where the property line would be shifting if those seawalls weren't there. Okay, I'm nearing the end, but I wanted to talk about these SEC disclosures and what they can teach us about coastal residential real estate. In March of this year, the SEC invited public comment for proposed rule changes that would require corporations regulated by the Commission to disclose certain climate-related risks in their registration statements and periodic reports, including information about climate-related risks that are reasonably likely to have a material impact on their business. Disclosing environmental risks is important because several corporations that report to the SEC own or at least manage physical assets that are located in areas at risk of damage or destruction due to storm surges or sea level rise or both. And we don't have to look very far, even though this is a federal administrative agency, to see how these rules would impact Hawaii. In Waikīkī, a lot of investors invest their money into corporations and hotels. And these corporations are in a way borrowing their money from investors to adapt to sea level rise, but they're not always being transparent with what the coastal hazards and how their buildings are being threatened by sea level rise. The SEC's proposed rule changes underscore the importance of climate-related disclosures in business transactions. Buyers should be aware of all the risks in their investment, including risks caused by climate change and coastal hazards. Expanding disclosure requirements to include climate-related risk is not only helpful for buyers, but for the market in general as well. Disclosures allow buyers in the market to pay the actual fair price of the product or property, and fair prices are exactly what they sound like. They're fair to both sellers and buyers. Without sufficient hazard disclosures, a buyer is more willing to purchase at a higher price than the fair market value of the property. Disclosures ensure that both sellers and buyers are getting a fair deal, which is true in securities trading as well as real estate transactions. This is important in the Hawaii real estate market or any real estate market affected by sea level rise because several coastal houses are in extremely vulnerable coastlines, yet are still being sold for above market price. And that isn't good for buyers and it's not good for the real estate market. I did want to highlight the timeliness of these disclosures and why those are important, because disclosures are only useful to the buyer if the buyer still has time to modify the deal or back out of the deal in general. Under the current law, the seller has 10 calendar days from the acceptance of the real estate purchase contract to disclose to the buyer all of the hazards on the property. And then once the buyer receives the disclosure statement, the buyer has 15 calendar days to examine this disclosure statement and decide whether to rescind on the deal or not. One individual I spoke with this summer told me that they were all about ready to sign the paperwork to purchase their home, and at the last second found out that there was a cesspool on the property. Fortunately, this person was able to work out a deal with the seller to lower the price, but it highlights the need to disclose critical information sooner rather than later. I'm finished on time, awesome. I did want to say, I know that these environmental topics can be kind of not depressing, but not super happy topics to talk about. But I just wanted to say that rebuilding and planning for sea level rise isn't going to be easy. The solutions that we come up with today are probably not going to be perfect, but I think that we can be hopeful that as a community, we can find solutions that protect the environment as well as our coastal residents. So thank you for listening.
Questions for Joel? If you're online, you can put your question into the chat box and we'll take questions from the room. Al?
Yeah, I was just curious, when you put things in a disclosure statement, what if there's like something on the property that didn't get a disclosure statement that like was illegal and then it could be fined? Or like we're talking about walls.
Yeah.
Walls.
Yeah, that's a really good question. For the people listening online, his question was what happens when there's an illegal structure on the land that doesn't get disclosed. And you can see that with the seawalls, where I was talking about earlier how the violations and the civil fines imposed on those homeowners affect the property and not necessarily the person that owns that property. So sometimes when that illegal structure isn't disclosed to the new buyer is upset that they have to inherit this giant problem and this really costly problem, which isn't fair to the buyer, and again, isn't fair to the real estate market in general.
Other questions for Joel? Brad?
John, Joel, thank you for digging into these topics. I'm wondering, in talking to the real estate associations in particular, do you come across any courses maybe that they already offer, or we could Sea Grant as another venue where Sea Grant could maybe provide curriculum materials to existing courses rather than trying to develop something new?
I'm not sure. I didn't talk to them too much about exactly what content they already have in their courses. But I do know that these continuing education courses cover a really wide variety of topics. So I'm sure that somewhere out there, there's a course and some content that Sea Grant could lend their expertise.
I want to ask you a question. So you did these interviews with Sea Grant programs in South Carolina and the Lake Champlain program. They have these continuing education courses in place. What's happened? Like, are people buying less risky properties? Like, are they seeing impacts from the courses that are in place in those states?
Mm-hmm. When I talked to the folks at Sea Grant, South Carolina and South Lake Champlain, I think the people that benefit the most from these continuing education workshops are the realtors themselves, and maybe not necessarily the clients, but just having these realtors be informed and be able to convey this information that they learn at these workshops to their clients has been really beneficial for them.
To the sellers or to buyers as well. I guess because realtors are interfacing with both buyers and sellers, so they have to communicate information to both those parties.
Yeah.
Beth, any questions online?
Everyone is saying good job, awesome job, good job. Ruby Pat, extension agent over at Hawaii, said great presentation. Another workshop topic could be what it means to buy or sell a property containing a seawall. Many people don't understand what a liability that can be.
Chip's got his hand up.
Oh, Chip has his hand up.
Oh, great. Let's take a question from Dean Fletcher's. You can unmute your microphone.
Hi, great job, Joel. And in fact, all three presentations have been very impressive. Joel, a question for you. So you spent all summer with this sea level rise disclosure policy. Do you feel it is sufficient? Is it adequate to alert a home buyer to the threat of sea level rise?
I'm going to give a lawyer answer and say it depends again, because
It's recorded.
Because when you look at the newly formatted real estate disclosure statement that the Hawaii Association of Realtors has a standard form for, Act 179 only includes one line out of dozens and dozens of disclosures. So it's at like line 32 out of maybe 100. It says, is the property going to be affected by sea level rise at 3.2 feet or something similar to that? So diligent buyers, which you would hope all buyers would be, would probably catch on to that, but they maybe don't understand what the implications of the property being affected by sea level rise is. So I think right now Act 179 is a really good start, but I definitely think that there could be further disclosures that would help the buyer and the market.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Similarly, I thought it was interesting when you showed the screenshot of the viewer that even if a property didn't have the solar REXA overlapping the actual property line, the road in front of it might have been completely flooded by sea level rise. And I think it would be prudent to consider adding on an addendum to the legislation saying that if you can't access the property due to sea level rise, that is probably as much of a financial impact for the buyer as the property itself being flooded. So thanks for your hard work.
A round of applause for all three. I'm going to bring Darren Lerner back to the front of the room, and he's going to say some stuff.
Stuff. That's it.
Anytime.
That's it. No, yeah, I mean, fantastic. 22 and 2022. Wow. Fantastic job. I really appreciate all the hard work that went into that. But not only, of course, with our students who bore the brunt of the hard work, but the mentors and the other support and all the folks that were involved. So thank you very much. It's always, you know, we don't get this opportunity enough, I think, and especially where we've come out of the pandemic in the last couple of years. So the opportunity to be here in person, and we miss the folks that aren't here in person, but we continue to grow kind of bigger numbers of people that are able to join us in the room here. And it really is so much of what the academia and what the university is all about. So thank you, everybody. Please feel free. We didn't plan anything formal after this, which reminds me, just to put it in your minds and think about next year. But if we can, we've had a lot of conversation and we have a lot of intent, if you will, to take this outside, take this into Peter's place, Peter Rappa's place at the benches there at MSB, do it on a Friday, bring out a screen, do our presentations, and I don't know, maybe beer shows up later in the day. So we'll see. If the university is far enough along a year from now, then that's where we'll be this time next year. Please join us. Thanks, everybody. Feel free to hang out here in the room and chat at least for another hour if you want. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maya.